All right.
So mute yourselves, by the way.
Actually, before everybody mutes themselves, one just initial question, which we covered a little bit in the introductions, but just want to get a feel for people's experience with Google Tag Manager. I'd imagine there's some people who are familiar with it and who use it, some who don't use it at all. Anybody want to kind of volunteer that? I don't know an efficient way to get that information out there.
Yeah, well, so we've got some reactions that we can use. So I think we're all limited to either clapping or hands up, thumbs up.
Yeah, how about just raise your hand if you have used Google Tag Manager before. So that'll either yeah, there we go. That's fine, real hands. Okay, it looks like it's about 50-50. Cool. And we have Amy June on the far end of don't even care. All right, I'll get started here. I'm gonna start the recording, share my screen. Where's my recording? Record on this computer. Start my slides, beautiful. All right, everybody see the slides? Again, I can't hear anybody. If you can't see the slides, we'll just, somebody will jump in. I'm gonna assume that everybody can see the slides. So we're gonna talk about Google Tag Manager and Drupal today, as we mentioned. And here we go. So, obviously, it's been an interesting time. Kind of the big thing that just I wanted to say is just really great to be able to get together with folks and still talk tech stuff, and also keep up with everybody in the community, even in these virtual times. So I hope everybody is doing well and keeping it together. All right. Okay, so yeah, and we went through the introduction, so I can kind of speed through this, but I'm Brian Perry. I'm a front-end developer. I live in Palatine. I like component-driven development and design systems and pattern libraries, and also all things Nintendo. And I'm on the internet in a bunch of places, and would love to catch up there following this. And I also work for Bounteous, as I mentioned. And from the perspective of this topic, it's interesting because I, years ago, worked for a analytics software company. We actually created software that would analyze log files, and also eventually kind of got into the more modern tag data collection. But kind of have a background in that, but since have focused on development for a number of years in Drupal. And at Bounteous, we have a pretty large analytics practice that help people implement analytics and do trainings and things like that. So my role has kind of shifted to just making sure that we can give the team and our clients what they need on their Drupal sites. So it's kind of an interesting, different perspective. And I would imagine that everybody has probably been here in this situation where you need to add analytics to your website, and you enable the Google Analytics module and put in the right code, and that's pretty much it. And that is totally fine. It's better than nothing for sure if you're looking to get analytics. But kind of what we're going to focus on today is the alternative of using Google Tag Manager, which provides some potential benefits. It's probably going to be a better choice if you expect to customize beyond the defaults, do any tracking that's really specific to your site, do event tracking, things like that. And we'll talk about why. And then also, it's really going to open up options as far as data collection being adjusted, or things updated around marketing campaigns without developer intervention. It's going to require less custom code changes. So there's potentially some advantages there. And it kind of depends on the project and potentially the client. But it's can be a really useful way to get yourself out of the critical path for some of this stuff. So before we dive into Tag Manager and kind of some of the modules for Drupal for Tag Manager, we'll talk just a little bit about the Google Analytics module that I imagine many are familiar with. But some of the setup here is even going to look pretty similar to what we see with the Tag Manager module, but with the Google Analytics module, you provide your web property ID, and that essentially inserts the tag code on your site. And then there's a number of configuration options, the tracking scope that you see here. So you can specify what domains are being tracked, if it's multiple domains, subdomains, things like that. As is often the case in something like the Blocks UI, for example, you can exclude different pages, you can exclude tracking based on role. And then there's also some advanced tracking options as well. So you can track user ID, you can provide options for people to opt out of tracking. There's link and download tracking, and then also like internal search. So you can provide data to specify what your internal search query string parameters are, things like that. And then also the ability to track a specific number of custom metrics and dimensions. So, specific types of data that you want to measure in analytics. And you can also use Drupal tokens for those. So you can pass in particular tokens about your Drupal data and have that pass to Google Analytics. And obviously on top of this, because it's loading the Google Analytics tracking script, you can write JavaScript to customize things and add additional events that you're tracking. So there's obviously ways you can customize beyond just this UI. And then also there are these advanced settings, which in general, I probably wouldn't recommend using personally, but could potentially get you out of a jam. It's possible to add additional JavaScript that gets executed for the tracking code. Essentially the main thing that can be done here. But if you get into that level of customization, I find that it's probably better to do it within your code base. So, little refresher on the Google Analytics module and some of what that provides you. But now let's talk about Google Tag Manager kind of in general and what that offers. So thinking of just a pretty generic example of what you might be looking to track on your website, the various things that people can do on your site. There's probably going to be general information about your company or product, but then information that you can download, maybe videos that people can watch that you want to track their engagement with, forms, purchases that can be made, things like that. So thinking of this very generic example, but all of those different actions people can take on your website, there's kind of two buckets that they fall into. There's certain things that just a default Google Analytics setup can get you. And it's really just basic metrics, basic tracking data, things like page views and visitor counts, browser metrics, things like that. But then a lot of those other types of interactions that were listed previously are things that require some amount of extra effort. Typically, it's what Google Analytics thinks of as an event. So there has to be some sort of interaction, and then JavaScript that fires an event tag off to Google Analytics. So there's certain things with the Google Analytics module that we saw before that you might be able to track with custom metrics, but a lot of these things, especially think of a video and how far someone interacted within a video and how long they stayed engaged. That's definitely something that is often going to require some custom code, firing off events to Google Analytics at certain points within the video. So kind of what we're getting towards here is that some of these areas where you need to take those extra steps to track some of the data, something like Google Tag Manager can help quite a bit. So if you want to collect more information, as we've kind of touched on a little bit, we need to essentially change the tracking code and change the data that we're passing along to our analytics tool. So we can add custom code to do that, or we can use Google Tag Manager. And also theoretically, we could do a little bit of both. But so what the function that Google Tag Manager serves in this particular case is you can think of it as a middleman between your website and your users. It kind of stands in between, and can essentially intercept the activity on of your users on your website. So Google Tag Manager itself, it's obviously a free tool, and it's pretty easy to set up. We'll look at the setup both on a little bit on the Google Tag Manager side, but also on the Drupal side. And you can track a lot of those additional metrics and things like conversion rates, et cetera, with a small amount of effort. Limited custom coding, as we mentioned before. And there's also in Google Tag Manager a lot of existing integrations and templates that you can use. There's also version control and permissions that can be set up within Tag Manager if you have different people with different rights as far as your analytics. And then, yeah, we also talked about things like templates, and there's a lot of different ways that you can have pre-existing solutions for different tools that are very easy to kind of set up with out-of-the-box Google Tag Manager options. And yeah, why does all this stuff matter? Some of these slides are slides that I borrowed from my coworker, John Meck, who really loves this Ron Popeil slide. I don't know if anybody has seen his set it and forget it infomercials, but it kind of splits the functionality on the site from tagging and marketing and analytics concerns. And it really provides flexibility so that once this general framework is set up on your site and set up with Google Tag Manager, it's possible without custom code, without intervention from developers, for analytics to be adjusted and tweaked by the people who are probably more familiar with day-to-day what's going on there, as opposed to a back-end developer who is probably working on and focusing on something completely different. So, and we'll actually take a quick look in the UI live towards the end. But this is just a screenshot of the Google Tag Manager workspace. So you have the ability to create a tag. And so, with this kind of being the middleman, like the very simplest example that you would potentially set up here is that you have essentially a tag that captures your data that's sent to Google Tag Manager and passes it along to Google Analytics. So again, it's just something that stands in the middle between your website and getting that data over to Google Analytics. But there are a whole bunch of different options for where your data can go once it gets into this system. And then also there's a really cool debug panel. So when you set up your tagging, you can go into preview mode, I believe it's called. And when you load a page on your site, your Drupal site, you'll see all of this debug data about what is getting collected by Tag Manager at even kind of different states in the page load. So you see the data that's being collected, where it's going. In the data layer, which we'll talk about in a bit, you can see an entire representation of the data layer that gets passed over to Google Tag Manager as well. So getting back to the Drupal side of things a little bit, after talking kind of generically about what Google Tag Manager is and why it might be valuable to you, the two modules that I recommend as far as setting this up on the Drupal side is the Google Tag Manager module and the dataLayer module. So the Google Tag Manager module is pretty straightforward in what it does. Some of its configuration is going to look pretty similar to like the first screen that we saw of the Google Analytics module, where you provide your container ID, your Google Tag Manager container. And by configuring that, it is basically going to add the necessary Google Tag Manager code on your site when a page loads. There's also a few configuration options, which allows you to like exclude certain paths. I think by default, it excludes like administration paths, things like that. If my colleague John Meck was here, he would tell you that what he wants as the person who deals with this data is for you to just send everything along, and on the GTM side, for them to pick what they care about. But there are some default options as far as what is and isn't tracked. But aside from this, the Google Tag Manager module itself doesn't really do that much. It basically just runs Google Tag Manager on your site. And then there's the concept of the data layer, which I've alluded to a few times, but we haven't really dug into all that much. So the data layer does a couple things. So it allows us to send data in a particular format over to Google Tag Manager. And it also allows you to keep track of events that happen on the page. I see a couple things in the chat here. And the question from Bob was, is there any downside to implementing GTM and the Drupal modules to experiment with live data? It depends on what you're using for where you're passing your data. So if you have like a little SANDBOX account with Google Analytics and Google Tag Manager, there's no downside to that. But if you were sending your data to a data set that matters, that would be a problem. And related to that, towards the end, actually, we'll do a little demo. And I actually have a SANDBOX repository with a Drupal instance that has set up for Google Analytics and Google Tag Manager. So that might be a quick way for people to pull down and experiment too. All right. And then, the data that's sent to the data layer is sent programmatically. It needs to be sent in a particular way. But the good thing is that the Drupal module that we're going to look at in a second really handles a lot of this work for you in just a nice, consistent way. And that's part of the reason why I recommend these two modules, even though a lot of this stuff could be done in code. By using these two things, you know that the data layer is going to be set up in a way that can kind of consistently and reliably send data over to Google Tag Manager. And the data layer in general is, not specific to Drupal, or even kind of conceptually not necessarily that, specific to just Google Analytics. So it's a format that a number of different technologies will send data over to Tag Manager. So as far as what it actually looks like, if you were to look in the source or even in the debug panel, it's just going to look like a big JSON object, for example. And this is based on the Bounteous site, one of our blog pages. Essentially what we got by enabling the data layer module with its default options. So the great thing that the data layer module does is it gets a lot of data related to Drupal and Drupal entities and things like that, even referenced entities, taxonomy, and automatically provide that to the data layer when the page loads. So the module itself actually does have quite a bit of configuration options. But as far as the default, it's a pretty reasonable starting point, and does get a lot of kind of the default additional Drupal data that you might want to make available to your analytics. But yeah, there's certain things that you can specify as far as, if you want to track taxonomy terms, and there's a helper library, a helper JavaScript library that you can enable that makes it a little bit easier to pass data in code back and forth to the data layer. And then there's also some configuration that you can do on a entity or content type basis. So if you wanted to pass additional data over to the data layer, you can check this include enabled field values option. This is essentially the way to do it in the UI with the module configuration. And then for any field that you have in Drupal, you can check that expose in data layer checkbox, and that will pass the data over to the data layer. So, and you can also configure what you want that field to be called in the data layer. So perhaps on the analytics side, you don't really care what the field is called in Drupal, and there's a more descriptive name that you want to use to label it. It's also pretty impressive what this can do. So if it's just like a regular text field, obviously you can pass that over. But it is also possible to access, fields on a reference entity and taxonomy terms and all kinds of cool stuff like that. So there's really a ton that you can do with this data layer module as far as just making this data available that typically would require some custom code. But since this is Drupal and a Drupal module, you also totally have your custom code option. So there's a number of hooks that the data layer module provides that lets you essentially alter the data layer before it gets rendered to the page. So this is another simple example from the Bounteous site. For some of the tracking that we did for essentially like tags on blog posts, in a previous version of our site, it was essentially represented in a particular way as like a pipe delimited string. So it would help out our analytics folks for like consistency across years, like if we took the same approach in our new Drupal site. So we just wrote this hook that takes the different taxonomy values and then pipe delimits them so that they can be represented that way. And there's, you can essentially do whatever you want in these different alter hooks as far as getting additional data into the data layer. And then again, so after you either through configuration in the module or in custom code, specify what the original and initial data layer should look like, it's going to be available when the page loads. Excuse me. And then that initial load with its data layer and Google Tag Manager loaded on the page, it passes that over to Google Tag Manager so that you can take that data and redirect it where you want. And the end result, if we're, again, just thinking about the simple example of Google Analytics, is that you can then take that data layer data and pass it as a Google Analytics tag that will then show up in Google Analytics. And here we have our modified pipe delimited taxonomy terms, for example. I think there was something in the chat here. Yeah, that's a good question, Bob. You're my #1 questioner. Congratulations. These examples are all Drupal 8 examples. I know there definitely is a similar Google Analytics module in Drupal 7. I think there's a tag manager module in 7. I cannot remember about the data layer in 7. But yeah, I can follow up on that. All right. Okay, so we talked about kind of the basic flow here of, all right, there is a data layer module in Drupal 7. Thanks, Gwen. So we talked about the basic flow of getting data into Google Tag Manager for kind of the initial page load. But we also talked about things like custom events on a page and interactions that happen client side after the page loads. So these are all kind of simple, in some cases, almost like pseudocode-like examples. But in your custom code in your JavaScript, you can essentially push things onto the data layer anytime after your page load to also make that available to Google Tag Manager. Excuse me. So you can say data layer push, and then a name value pair here for your event. And then some other kind of concepts here. You could have something that fires on a like a link click You know, I probably wouldn't recommend it literally being in the on-click. You might have some sort of event handler that does that. But, you know, really simple example, if you want to track somebody clicking a download link or something, you could pass that and push that onto the data layer. And then you can also do that in any of your custom JavaScript code as well. You can call that push API to send data. So this is an example with like a slider. So you could actually use this to track how far somebody gets through one of those wonderful, always super useful carousels on your site. So a lot of possibilities there as well. And then also, we probably won't get too far into this, as it's not all that Drupal specific and more kind of on the Google Tag Manager side. But there's also a lot of options in Tag Manager as far as being able to essentially write custom code in Tag Manager, so that even some of the things that you could do in your Drupal code, as far as pushing things onto the data layer, it could, in the code in Google Tag Manager, actually look for selectors on your page and pass data to the data layer that way. So again, it really kind of opens up the possibilities as far as you know, the responsibility for these things and flexibility as far as data tracking goes. And then the other thing to kind of touch on, I know that a lot of what I'm focusing on is you know, taking this data and passing it over to Google Analytics as an example. But this data that you collect through the data layer and through Google Tag Manager, you can, again, with Google Tag Manager being your middleman, you can send it wherever you want. And there's a number of other sources or destinations for your Google Tag Manager data in the GTM admin. So that's another reason and another big value of Google Tag Manager as opposed to Google Analytics. If you're looking to use some of this data outside of just Google Analytics, there's a lot of really interesting possibilities. So let's see, a few other things. So thinking a little bit about, again, who makes these changes, which we talked about a little bit before. There's a few blog posts that we have just to plug our own Bounteous site, but there's a lot of great posts there. These two, I'll share these slides afterwards too, but there is a developer's guide to implementing the data layer, and then a non-developer's guide to Google Tag Manager. So depending on your particular perspective, it might help you be able to understand typically the process to getting some of this information into Tag Manager, getting into the data layer, and some possibilities as far as where the kind of sharing of responsibilities can lie here. And then on the Drupal side, and I think it's probably what resulted in me joining everybody here today to give this talk. I wrote a post a while back, a Drupal-friendly Google Tag Manager configuration with the data layer module. Nice little mouthful there. But from my experience with the Drupal modules, as far as like where the responsibility lies, can kind of be somewhere in the middle. There's actually a lot of customization you can do in the admin UI using these two modules. In some cases, for custom code that's really specific to the inner workings of your Drupal site, it might make sense for that to be in typical developer code in your code base. But there's also a lot of possibilities for smaller things and smaller events that are actually completely driven within Google Tag Manager configuration. Which kind of leads to the next point of, does Google Tag Manager make sense for you? I would argue it probably does, even if you are just doing a small amount of customization to what you're looking to do in Google Analytics, because it will probably result in less custom code if you go beyond just the defaults of what the Google Analytics module offers. We talked a lot about it potentially taking you as a developer out of the critical path for some of the analytics needs. There's also a lot of great prepackaged options that exist. And also, if you have a need for this data outside of just Google Analytics, this is by far your best option. But it also might not be for you. It does require some additional initial setup. You have our middleman of GTM here, so it's kind of another layer of abstraction that we're introducing. So, if you're really looking to just get kind of the bare minimum analytics, maybe it's overkill. And then also a pretty common reaction that developers may have here is that they want the control here. They want to be able to control when code gets executed and when this data is sent and things like that. And it's possible that there may be cases where your client needs more oversight, or it makes more sense for you to be the person controlling those things. But even in that case, Google Tag Manager still might make sense in that maybe your client is just going to look through Google Analytics to see their data, and that's really the only view that they care about. And you're the person who's responsible for Google Tag Manager configuration. And then also, you would be surprised the advantages to, again, taking yourself out of this critical path, when it makes sense on a project or client basis. And then also we talked a little bit about like those templates that are available. There's a number of templates that are available for like common Google Suite projects. But also, interestingly enough, just today, the Bounteous folks, the Bounteous Analytics folks have been working with Google and Acquia to provide a template for Acquia Lift. So it actually just kind of informally soft launched today. So this is in the community template gallery, which is pretty cool. Obviously, only relevant if you're using Acquia Lift, but gives you some idea of the kind of existing out-of-the-box templates that can help you with some prepackaged configuration. And I see another question here in the chat. Oh, just encouragement from Bob, which I'll take. Very cool. So I'm assuming we probably still have a little bit of time. I can just do a quick demo with that little SANDBOX profile just to show super simple example of what this actually looks like in practice. Would that be helpful to folks? I'll give people the opportunity to object, but otherwise I will just proceed on. Okay, so as I mentioned, just have a little super simple kind of out-of-the-box Drupal sandbox that has Google Tag Manager and the dataLayer module configured. So under Google Tag Manager, really the only thing that I changed here was the container ID. So if you actually use the sandbox and use the install script, it has just a default value for the container ID, but you can change it to whatever value you need for your Google Tag Manager account. And then under dataLayer, I also don't believe I changed really much of anything. So it's kind of the default options here. But just looking deeper at some of the options, you have a lot of control over like what metadata is going to be sent through for your entities, depths of paths that you want to track, and you can specify which of your taxonomies you want to pass data for. A lot of really cool options there. And I saw more stuff in the chat. 30 minutes, as much as I need. I will not use all 30 minutes. The container ID is it's a field, like an option in the module, but that is actually the code that you get when you set up Google Tag Manager. And we can actually jump over there now. So this is actually just a little Google Tag Manager dashboard for this kind of sandbox account. And this is the container ID right here. I think if I click on it, it would show the script that if you're not using these modules, you'd need to include on all of your pages. But instead, you can just copy the container ID and paste it into the module, which is nice. There we go. And then, since this is just a simple example that just uses Google Analytics as far as where it passes its data, we have under tags, just a tag for Google Analytics. And really not much in the way of settings. There's one settings variable that I set up, and you can add a new variable here I think if I go back, I can see it. So I have this user-defined variable that's used by that tag, and it's the Google Analytics tracking ID in this case. So that's the thing you get when you set up Google Analytics that specifies where your data is going in Google Analytics. And then also, again, this is all pretty default, but as far as what triggers the tag firing to Google Analytics, there's options you can have here in Tag Manager too. I'm just saying all page views that come through, send them over to Google Analytics as well. But you could have it be a subset of your pages or direct it to different profiles within Google Analytics and things like that. So going back to the workspace, as I mentioned, it's possible to click on this preview button. And that is going to bring you into preview mode. So the nice thing about the preview mode is when that's enabled, you can kind of see the changes that you've made to your current configuration in Tag Manager. I haven't made any changes, but if you were like trying out a new tag, you'd want to enable this and kind of see what data is coming through. But I'm really just enabling this now to see the debug mode. Get this thing out of the way here. So if I go back to my Drupal sandbox and reload the page, you'll see that the Tag Manager debug panel just pops up, and it gives me all that data about what's happening when the page loads. So we see that there's one tag that fired on this page to Google Analytics. We can even look at the data layer and see the values that we have in the data layer. I think this is for the initial load, but if we look at the page view, I guess that's still all that we're passing to the data layer here. I think this might be just because it's on the home page. But it's an easy way, again, to kind of see specifically what's getting passed along to the data layer, especially at the different points in the life cycle of the page loading. And then if I jump over here just to have something slightly more exciting, I created a page specifically for this demo at the alias of Fox Valley. And if we look in the data layer, yeah, okay, this is more along the lines of what I was expecting because it's a basic page. We get a lot more data about the entity itself here. And then if I go into Google Analytics, I can see that there's one active user right now on the site, that's me, that's going to that Fox Valley page. So again, Google Tag Manager just stands as the middleman and takes that data and passes it along to analytics. But it could pass along to analytics in any other number of places. I think I saw another one. So Bob's question was, how are you seeing the info about the tag manager? As in the debug panel, I'm assuming you're asking, Bob? Yeah, so that is the preview mode. So I clicked on in Google Tag Manager this preview button. And if I leave preview mode and then go back and reload the page, we won't see that debug information anymore, but we will still see, we should see anyway, the request come through from to Google Analytics from Google Tag Manager. Let's see here. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, it's just that preview mode in Google Tag Manager. I was just doing that really just to show the debug information, but you could change the configuration for a tag, add new tags, and there is like some level of version control in Tag Manager. So those changes don't go live until you publish them or submit them. So that preview mode is also a way that you can make sure that your configuration is actually working before you publish it out to a live site. Cool. And then, so that was, obviously a super simple high-level demo, but hopefully gives you a little bit more of a feel for kind of the end-to-end flow there and what those modules let you do. And then, as I mentioned, there's a SANDBOX repository. I'll share it on the Meetup page, a little bit.ly link. But it has just a default Drupal install with these modules enabled, and install script that just does kind of a default setup. So an easy way to get a Drupal site up and running, where you can just plug in your tracking IDs and experiment with your test Google Analytics and Google Tag Manager account. And then just another thing to mention, for those interested in this topic, we do a number of trainings on the Google Marketing Suite and Google Analytics and Google Tag Manager. It used to be throughout North America. Now we're obviously doing virtual trainings. But if you're interested in learning more, we do them throughout the year, and totally worth checking out. So if anybody has questions, either via the chat or if people want to unmute. And Amy June learned something. I accomplished something today. Fantastic. But yeah, hopefully that was useful and interesting, and it was great to talk to actual people who don't live in my house.
The actual people who don't live in the house. Ah, that was great.
Cool.
So before your comment to Amy June, I had a question. I can't remember what it was. Oh God, been a long day.
It's okay if you forget, Bob, because you certainly racked up as many question points as possible, which I appreciate.
I'm an old guy, right? Yeah. So I think everybody should unmute. Let's give Brian a big round of applause.
All right. Good job.
And yay, Brian. That was awesome.
It's deafening. Oh, my Lord.
It was really good. No, it really was.
Feels much less mysterious now.
So
Even Joe clapped.
I guess my question is, okay, so we've got this project right now. It's the only project we've got that's not deep sixed right now. But we're just starting to put together their reports.
Mm-hmm.
And we're kind of wondering what can we do with GA or with the tag manager that we're not already doing with GA. And Sally probably has a couple of questions around that too.
Yeah, well, what we're thinking about is on this particular site, they have a very long sales process. So your conversion isn't like they bought the gadget on the site. The site is mostly informational with a contact form. So what we're considering conversion is they fill out the contact form.
Yep.
So what I'm thinking is we attach the Google Tag Manager to that thank you page for the contact form, so we know they actually filled it out.
Yeah, I mean, so, especially even just with a form like that, there's, with just the default analytics, you're only going to be able to get, did they get to the form and did they get to that thank you page, right? Yeah. So there'd have to be some additional custom tracking to get information beyond that. Mm-hmm. And my take is that it's probably going to be easier for you in the long run to do that sort of event tracking with something like Tag Manager. It's certainly possible with Google Analytics, but if you wanted insight into what's causing people to not complete the form, you'd probably have to do some sort of event tracking on the form elements or when there's an error state on the form.
Yeah.
And again, it's definitely something that's possible to do with just Google Analytics, but it's probably going to be a little bit easier, especially if there continue to be more cases where you have to do that sort of thing, to do it with Tag Manager. But then the other thing, if you want to start thinking ambitiously, right? especially because you say the site is mostly informational. If you ever wanted to try to get to the point where you're having some sort of like cross-channel representation of conversions, Google Tag Manager would really be the only way to do that. So if there is some way you can take the data from your website and tie it into something else that happens outside of your website, Tag Manager would definitely be the way to do that.
So what do you mean by outside of your website? Like what?
Yeah, that gets pretty complicated, and I have been out of that game for a very long time. But I mean, it starts to get into like the kind of third-party tracking cookie kind of stuff. So it could be ads that are outside of your website. It could be cross-domain stuff. I know that's getting harder and harder to do now with browser restrictions. But it's definitely what everybody wants to get. And then what are some other examples? So if you have like any other way to identify your visitors that is like if there's a username that they use, for example, both on your website and in an application, that might be another case where you can have something that's like at least cross technology.
Here's the thing, with just GA, you can see if they came in from a post on LinkedIn, for instance. Okay, so you can see that. Maybe if could you use Tag Manager to go to see if they went from the site back to LinkedIn?
So you could see, and that could potentially still be something that you could do with Google Analytics. You could see
oh yeah, the exit.
You could see where they abandoned. To actually get an indication that they went over to LinkedIn, you would probably have to like capture a like link click if you have that on your page. You won't actually be able to know that they landed on LinkedIn or anything they did on LinkedIn.
Right.
Unless you have some sort of relationship with LinkedIn.
Right. Bob, does that site have links to LinkedIn? I don't remember off the top of my head. Bob or Avery remembers that.
Yeah, it's got some links to LinkedIn, but
okay.
I guess more what I'm thinking of is that, you know, we're trying to track specifically what pages they filled out the form on, and sometimes that could be a project page, that could be a project type. So think about this is a site that's got buildings and different types of building construction. And so people come in from LinkedIn, for instance, and then they're looking at, oh, I've got a project that's a parking ramp. And now I'm going to go look at this parking ramp, and there's one of those pages that's a particular project. That's where they fill the format out at, and we're tracking the form that they filled out. You know, the URL for the project that they filled the form out at. But I'm not sure if we can get better information off Tag Manager, especially with data layers. You know, pulling all the other related data.
Yeah, because everybody lands on the same thank you page afterwards.
Yeah.
So it'd be useful to know which page they came from, which page was the link to the contact form.
Right.
Yeah.
So talking about forms, another example that kind of comes to mind, and it can be hard to kind of understand where the line is and where, you know, using Tag Manager can really help you. And I'll preface this by saying I don't know if there's any modules that specifically assist with like web form, the web form module and Tag Manager.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering too, right?
But think about if you were in a situation where a new web form was added in like a production environment. Obviously, I know that there are potentially reasons why you wouldn't want to do that. But if you know, you had a situation where you're treating a form more as content, right? And you wanted to be able to track kind of on you know, more of an event basis their interaction with elements of that form. If you were just using Google Analytics, the only way that you could really get at that would be to have custom JavaScript that captures those events when there's interactions. And with Google Tag Manager, and I didn't really get into this, but you could, on the Google Tag Manager side, configure things to, based on selecting an element on that form, to capture those events just through the Google Tag Manager configuration. So you can do that without a code deployment.
Right.
And
Okay,
again,
so we'd have to have
that.
a tag on each page, right? Each page that has that contact form.
It would have tag, so I've done a little bit of this, and how that's done is like basically with CSS selectors is a good way to say that that's the event. So let's just say it's a page that's like /project1, and you know that the body tag of Drupal is going to say that it's project1 in the as a class that's on the Drupal body tag. So you could say, I know that the ID of the button click for that form, so you could say .project1, the ID of that button click, and in Tag Manager say, I'm going to capture this event in Tag Manager. And this is where Brian's talking about Tag Manager just opens up all this flexibility, because you could set this all up, and this is all the way answering back to Bob's question of will it break anything? It doesn't really break anything, because if you don't set up that selector right, it just won't track it. So you set up this tracking test and say it's just a CSS selector to say when somebody clicks this button, and while it's an ID on multiple pages, it's a very unique selector. And in Tag Manager, you can say .project1 #submit button. And then on another page, I could set up another rule in Tag Manager. Again, this doesn't have to be any code deploys or anything. /project2, which we know on the body tag is .project2, which is a CSS class. You could say that selector, when that button is clicked, it's going to be a second event and a third event. So does that make sense? So it frees up.
Yeah.
I did this with a project where we came up with naming structures of like URLs and projects, even the markup inside the page to make unique selectors. So we know add to cart, we don't want to put an event on every single add to cart or write a custom JavaScript event on every single add to cart button in an e-commerce situation. But what we do have control over is markup around that and URLs around that. And that's where Tag Manager just completely frees you up to say, I'll set up this situation and watch a click. Is it working? Is it working? Adjust the selector. Is it working? Yeah. And then now you start gathering data, and data is powerful over time. Can't stress enough Brian's first slide of saying, put analytics on today, like right now, because time is on your side for analytics. And tracking is all about setting up the right thing. So Brian, anything to add to that? That's been my experience with Tag Manager and custom selectors to fire events. It's been liberating for sure.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. Yeah, the other thing that comes to mind, and it might not be something that you're actively doing, but like thinking about A/B testing and situations where like the content is out of your control, but you still want to be able to track those differences. And and also just the general idea, right? It depends on your project. It depends on the people who are involved. But like at Bounteous, we're lucky that we do have a lot of people who specialize and focus in analytics, and giving them the tools to be able to make, for example, even just small changes regarding the analytics, and not having me have to drop some feature I'm working on to add that and deploy it is incredibly valuable.
Yeah, it lets you Google Tag lets you do a couple other, like if you, for example, want to use some other services like Hotjar, you can connect that to the Google Tag, and then you've got heat maps for your site if you pay for that service, or you've got or some other service that might be free. There's a couple other ones that do that.
What you're saying is definitely should be another slide, is that it's a black box for anything that you want to track and do. So Hotjar, if you don't know it, is really amazing insights. It's really powerful. Any heat map is great. So again, an analytics person can just drop those in. and start tracking without a deployment. So it's a black box of stuff. Go ahead,
You
Brian.
can actually kind of think about it, going back to the Drupal realm, as like the contrib space for analytics. So if you're just using Google Analytics, like you get the things that Google Analytics does, or you can write custom code. If you're using Tag Manager, there's a whole bunch of integrations and templates and all kinds of fancy stuff you can do that are just options that are available to you. You can turn on your module, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't.
So we've done Hotjar, Crazy Egg, and which is like a heat map. So we as developers don't care. Analytics people say we want to start tracking and seeing customer experience. They just go to Tag Manager and drop it in, and we have no insight into it. We get all the benefits of it because then they tell us what they did. But that's what I've seen is really powerful with why you'd want Tag Manager right from the start.
So that's an interesting comment. So Tag Manager right from the start. You know, what our approach to that would be, okay, that guy that's like, yeah, I just installed Google Analytics and meta tag, we got the basic config. All right, we're done. See you later, bye. But there's always more that you want to try and do. So from a site builder's perspective, you might pepper some tokens that come in from the web form, for instance. Let's take the web form example. So got a parking garage, somebody's looking at a project that was done as a parking garage. So that's a project category, and they fill out the form, right? So right now we just grabbed the URL from the project that they got, right? That gives us an idea of where they click that, where they put that web form at. We don't want to have 18 different web forms, one for each project category, or certainly not one for each project. So we only want to have one list of results that somebody's dealing with as the client. But we want to get all the information related to that. To me, that's where the Google Tag Manager can really come into play without doing a lot of that back-end stuff, grabbing the tokens from where all these things came from or what they're all related to in the database. Does that make sense?
Yep, for sure. And also at the end of the day, I mean, it is, especially now that you have some overview of these modules, it's probably a matter of minutes of additional configuration.
Yeah.
That one time.
You keep it simple for the client. They go to one place to get their web form links, but they've got all this good, rich data that they can pull off of.
Yeah, these are great questions. And, you know, if the next time I give a talk like this, I would definitely try to focus a little bit more on these use cases of like why. So that's helpful.
I mean, that's kind of what I was looking at was where's the use case? Because when I first read your first blog post that prompted me to say, "Hey, Brian, can you do a topic?" It's like, wow, that looks really complicated. I don't know that we want to get there because our clients won't want to pay for that.
It's one of my skills, making things seem more complicated than they are.
No, that's my skill. That's why there's the saying, keep it simple, Snodgrass. ISS, right?
That is keep it simple, Sally.
Well, that works too, yeah.
So Bob, you and I need to sit down and do a screen share and decide where to put these things on that site.
Yeah, it'd be kind of cool to play around with that on this site.
Yeah.
This site especially, because it would be a cool little case study.
Yeah, and honestly, this particular client wants like the 30,000 foot view. They don't want a lot of granularity. I mean, you know, it's really, I mean, they're the company, they're engineers. They don't get as excited about the minutia of this as we do. You know? but they want to know, I bought this website and I've invested in it, time and money and effort, and so what am I getting from it? So
Yeah.
Need to be able to show them that.
Yeah, cool. Everybody else is so quiet.
Well, it looks like Joe Vangsness joined us.
Was
Yes,
that no?
I was actually on a different computer that didn't have a microphone, so.
Oh my God! Oh, how are
I,
you?
I came home and I turned that on to get it started. Then I went to fix dinner. I came back and I missed your introductions. But I want to say one thing. There is a Google Analytics tag, there's a Google Tag Manager meetup. And I went to one of their meetings, I think in October or November.
Really?
They met at a place at 1871 in the Merchandise Mart. And they were way beyond me, but I am interested in this thing. I have done some things. I've tracked downloads. I had this client about 4 or 5 years ago that had about 40 or 45 articles that he made into a PDF and PDFs on his website, and we had to track in Google Analytics, sort of look at what people were downloading, and it was coding in that on-click thing and giving the name to it was kind of a pain in the ass. So,
Put it bluntly, yes.
Yeah.
what's odd, if you use that AWS stats that comes with cPanel hosting, they tell you what PDF files were downloaded. You don't have to do any work at all.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, it was a little bit of repetition. But I think it's a great thing. I mean, it just opens up a lot of possibilities. I'm glad to see. I wasn't aware of these Drupal modules, so this was really a good presentation for me.
Yeah, very good.
And I appreciate you broadcasting this meeting, Bob. It means I'll get home a lot earlier than I usually do when I by the train. Now, in the future meetings, Bob, once you're back on site at the Old Town Pub, have you considered having the in-person meeting there, but also broadcasting your meeting with Zoom?
We absolutely have. In fact, I was talking with San Francisco, who you may have missed, Amy June. Amy June was here for a bit, and Andy Olson and I, we've all been talking about this. And the mid-camp thing was also talking about doing hybrid stuff. I think that's one little offshoot I think that we're going to see a lot more of, is those opportunities for being there remotely rather than in real life.
I picked up, as you know, I've done a lot of work with search engine optimization and Drupal, and I've been recommended to people to look at their website and find out why they're not getting results. And some of the websites I picked up have been WordPress sites. So I found a market for people who want to fix WordPress sites relative to SEO. So I started learning WordPress, and I started going down to Beverly at 95th to the Beverly WordPress Meetup. And I gave a
That's a
talk
good meetup,
there
yeah.
last August on SEO for anybody. And I met a lot of people there. And so then I saw that there's a WordPress meetup in Barrington. And last Wednesday, they had a presentation on SEO for WordPress. So originally I wanted to go to it, and I saw that there was a metro train that had stopped about 2 blocks from the tavern where this meetup was scheduled. But then the meetup got turned into a virtual meetup. They had 96 people sign up for it. Now, not all those got on the meeting, but at the end of the meeting, the organizer was saying, this is really great. I'm glad we could do this, but I really want to have in-person meetings. So in the chat box, I suggested that they have the in-person meeting, but broadcast it. And 3 people said, yes, I agree with that. So it's possible that I'll be able to virtually attend those things in Barrington.
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity, but I guess the logistics are the big thing. So you're trying to, present the presenter in real life as much as possible, and or their presentation. And everybody that's there, either whether they're in a group at the place that you're meeting, or whether they're remote, and how do you balance all that so that everybody's got a fair say and fair set of questions and all that. So I think it takes a little bit more people to manage that. You have to have a monitor or a couple of them and a host, and then the people who are hosting the in live thing as well. So
Well,
a bit more manpower, but it's doable, I think.
Well, at the Barrington, the school did a great job. They had this thing set up where they had a couple of polls throughout. Like in the beginning, you wanted to know how many people have worked with Tag Manager. They did the same thing. They had a poll that came up, and you clicked in, and they got the result right away. And they scheduled this presentation to have 4 stops in the middle. And if you wanted to ask a question, you filled it out in a chat box. And the meeting organizer, when they took their break, read off to the speaker what the questions were. So you were able to intersperse those things. But my thought was, if you're having an in-person meeting, the primary audience is your in-person group. And the main thing for a remote person, you really want to see what's on the screen and what the speaker says. The questions are great as well. Yeah. But there's really a big benefit of seeing all these slides and demonstrations. And that's really not that hard to do in itself.
Yeah, so I wanted to show, well, I'm glad you brought that up because this is kind of interesting. I wanted to hopefully show what we're doing with the Otter thing. So this is the live transcript of what we were talking about as we went through the thing. So here's 7:24, and this is probably all Brian talking here. And when you get done with all this and you publish it with the video, it actually tracks the words as they're saying it with the audio,
okay,
which is pretty awesome. So how do you pull all that together? I'm not exactly sure yet, but it's kind of cool. So if I go down to the bottom, okay, maybe I'm done.
So maybe what you do is you have the speaker repeat the question, or
yeah. So you may drop off the first couple of words. It's certainly not
up to 40 minutes, Bob.
Yep. What?
It's up to 40 minutes. We went over, but agree that it says recording transcription is up to 40 minutes.
Oh, I'm
capturing
over my limit. Damn it.
You got to give them cache. You can see it's still capturing it. But Bob, the cool thing about this is it's time stamped. So it was really accurate when Bob, you and I looked at this, and then it syncs up to the video that we're recording. So this is like when you upload a video to YouTube, it auto captions, but you're beholden to whatever captioning YouTube has, and this Otter seems like it's a little more accurate. But in the end, the cool thing about this Otter too is it picked up different speakers. So Bob has a different frequency than myself, and this Otter knew that when Bob spoke versus me, and then you could assign that to them, and it integrated with Zoom. So that's why we said we were testing this out today. We ran out of 40 minutes, but it's a really cool tool.
Yeah. It's got a lot of potential. Now, you know, we're just feeding Google's AI though. May or may not be good. I don't know.
Yeah, just stop filling out surveys on Facebook. You'll be good.
The contact tracing is going to be really tight. Yeah. That may be a good thing.
Yeah.
Who knows? Ay. Crazy stuff though. But yeah, there's a lot of potential for all the things that are going on, especially right now.
Yeah, I think back to the things that Bob and I have done, and a lot of the great things that MidCamp just did. I know I'm up for when there's another in-person one to try and give it a go. It takes effort, as Bob said, and coordination of who's doing what and who's sharing what, but I don't think it's out of the realm of pulling it off. It's at the cost of an organizer dedicated to that and having like a computer dedicated to that.
Yeah.
But I think it's a great idea, and I think I know I've attended a lot more this past week. I attended two. I already attended one meetup last night, which was the Chicago accessibility one. Then I attended 2 other meetups last week just because I could. It was a lot easier to attend those than not. One was a really good layout builder conversation from the San Francisco group.
It was good. It was really good.
And I think the camps, both Drupal and WordPress, do a really great job of getting the presentations recorded and things like that, because you have a much larger team and more technology happening there. And so hopefully we can pass some of that DNA down to the meetups to get the same kind of thing going on.
Yeah, there's always a lot of good stuff that goes on at meetups.
Oh yeah.
It's not all just fun and games. But I like to think a lot of it is.
Not all of them meet in taverns. Some meet in classrooms and things like that. But but when we're at home, you can have whatever you want.
Exactly right.
Should we wrap the recording up and then?
Yeah, I think we should turn that off. I think because
right.
we're like at that mode of we shouldn't be turning. We shouldn't be.